Our speaker this morning has spent her life supporting and promoting the integrity of scientific research and development in the energy sector. Michelle Weinman has spent her career facilitating collaboratives, conversations, and working towards compromise. As we saw yesterday, all we do comes back to how we connect with one another in our ecosystems. Michelle has proved time and again her skill in doing just that. Michelle comes to us from the National Council of Science and the Environment, an organization dedicated to improving the scientific basis for environmental decision-making. Previously, Michelle served as Director of Intergovernmental Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy. In that role, Michelle led the department's engagement with the state, regional, and local governments on issues across the DOE complex, including renewable energy, science, fossil energy, and environmental cleanup. Yesterday, the theme of resilience weaved through our sessions, reminding us that we must have the ability to identify, assess, measure, and optimally predict what, for the most part, is uncertain and episodic. New opportunities and possibilities for our new energy future always has as its core the pioneering activity of a scientific community that has the capability and integrity to take us to new frontiers and challenge old models of thinking and acting. The impact of the scientific endeavor in our efforts to build that which preserves and enhances the quality of life and all forms of life on our island planet is central and cannot be compromised. Michelle's extensive experience prior to joining the Department of Energy includes founding Applied Solutions, local governments building a clean economy, and leading ICLEI USA, both of which are nonprofits engaged directly with cities, counties, and states on clean energy, environmental, and sustainability issues. The rest of Michelle's impressive work is in our conference program. So let's give a warm aloha and welcome Michelle Weinman, who will speak to the resilience of scientific integrity in uncertain times. Michelle?
Good morning. Aloha. Thank you, Frank, as well as Doug, Jonathan, and the entire organizing committee for the Maui Energy Conference for inviting me here. And thank you to the students of Maui High School. Although they're not here in the room this morning, the video that we just saw gives me hope for the future. In many ways, these students, these young people, represent the reason that we all are here today. To ensure the energy future is strong, stable, and resilient for many decades to come. To sustain a quality of life for our children and generations going forward. I'd also like to thank all of you for spending the next half hour with me, hopefully well caffeinated. I want to encourage you during the course of the next 20 minutes or so that I'm speaking to really think about questions that you might have. We'll have a few minutes at the end, and you can provide those questions. I think we'll show a slide up here in a second where you can key them into your iPhone the same way that you were yesterday. So they'll be showing that slide, there it is, a couple of times during my remarks. But I'm doing this without slides. One, it's the morning, and two, there's nothing worse than having someone read off the slides for all of you. So I've been preparing for this event for several months now, and with other talks that I've given recently on policy and politics, I find myself editing up until the last minute, given the rapid pace of policy change and position in Washington, D.C. right now. It's quite an exciting place. Originally, when I considered this morning's presentation, I was going to focus on energy resilience, that upstream research and provocative as well as persuasive communications could inspire policymakers at the state and especially the national level, to consider science a strength in the context of energy strategy, planning, and economic development. To view science as an asset that they use often to inform healthy debates that yield smart decisions and good policy to address things like the energy roller coaster we are all currently riding on, regardless of state, regardless of place. The country is in a very different place than it was last time at this year, last fall, or even this past January. In my role with the National Council for Science and the Environment, I have the privilege of working with a lot of scientists across many fields and abilities, including formal, natural, and social sciences. However, my background is policy. I've spent many years working with government at all levels to advance sustained progress that results in smart energy policies that include economic wins and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As I mentioned briefly yesterday during the panel in the morning, science has always served as the strength behind good energy policy. Interestingly, today science as a field is experiencing a level of attention that couldn't have imagined 6 months ago. And scientists who 6 months ago may have been wishing that people would pay more attention to their fields may now be thinking they should be more careful for what they wish for. The sad irony is that science as an enterprise is under a level of threat not experienced in modern time. From being national heroes in the era of great discoveries, the 1950s and the space race, scientists are now looking over their shoulder every day in their labs, on their benches, and in their offices. NCSC faces many of the same challenges that other science societies do right now. How do we promote the use of science in policymaking while remaining apolitical, especially when science has become so politicized? When science, regardless of discipline, is called into question, what happens next? Since the beginning of mankind, science has served as the bedrock for human innovation, technological advancements, and the ability to put a man on the moon, saved entire civilizations from extinction due to disease, and provided the basis for energy advancements ranging from solar panels to biofuels, to wind farms, and the list goes on. So what does one do? Science matters to everyone. It touches all of us. It doesn't discriminate. If science is a trusted and essential element of a functioning and progressing society is under threat, arguably we all are. What can be done? It's tricky. To give some context to my point, I want to share a recent experience with you all. NCSE, my organization, holds an annual conference in January that is widely attended by everyone from academics and researchers to industry leaders and government. At this year's conference in January, we had a number of excellent keynote and plenary speakers, including Dr. France Cordova, the current director of the National Science Foundation, and former Governor Bill Ritter from Colorado. I believe he actually was a keynote speaker here in a former year for the conference. He now leads an energy think tank engaging with state legislators across the country with the aim of deepening energy literacy. We were also fortunate at the conference to have former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. I recognize that to many who know him and who followed his politics, he could be challenging for a variety of reasons. It certainly raised some eyebrows across our stakeholders. That's not, however, why we invited him to address more than 1,000 scientists. We didn't invite him because we wanted to be a political organization, but rather because we're a nonpartisan organization, and because his perspective, given the new administration, was and is important. We wanted to have a look inside. Many of our members strongly opposed our decision because despite his background in science, he is very expressly a political figure. Not exactly what you would expect an apolitical organization to do, to provide a platform to him. But this is the position that we and other organizations like ourselves find ourselves in these days. To serve our mission of promoting science, its value and use, we've never shied away from engaging politicians, but we've always tried to avoid being political in doing so. It's a fine line to walk, but I think smart leadership can do it, and we have to. So we invited Speaker Gingrich for that reason. It would be silly to pretend that the problem people had with him is because he was political or a politician by background. The problem they had with him was very specifically because of his politics. As it turns out, Speaker Gingrich delivered an excellent keynote. Like any good speaker or politician, he read the room, And he knew that by and large, the crowd was skeptical at best. Again, keep in mind, the majority of folks at our conference are scientists. He started by asking anyone who felt anxious about the incoming president to raise their hand. The room was a sea of raised hands. People were standing along the walls. If it had been this room, every seat was filled. And with that effective question, he relieved a lot of the anxiety and tension in the room. He then went on to share some advice that I believe is good and I wanted to share with you. He said there will always be room for solid science in making smart policy. Deliver scientific research, data, and analysis without being overly prescriptive about the response you seek. The climate change movement, as an example, he said, has been off the mark since it started, in great part due to its approach. While the science supports the argument that the climate is changing, the climate movement has not only required that everyone believe in climate change, but that also the cause of the changing of the climate be agreed to. That human activity is the cause of climate change, thereby imposing responsibility without due process on all sectors that contribute to the rise in greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with the speaker's view of climate science or the climate movement, nor am I suggesting that you should or shouldn't. I do suggest, however, that there's an opportunity to learn from what he said, to consider it this way, that regardless of your political persuasion, scientific research and the innovations, solutions, and progress it represents must continue. So we need to listen to each other, think about the language, now more than ever. Today's politics are intense, and we have yet to see what the trickle-down effect will be on state and local governments, markets and sectors, most importantly on people in the communities where they live. Thank goodness we have history to ease the uncertainty a bit. Consider this. 3 of the most important science-driven policy initiatives taken by the federal government in modern history were all signed into law by Republican presidents. The establishment of the EPA under President Nixon, as well as the Clean Air Act in 1970 and Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act in 1972. The Ozone Treaty, better known as the Montreal Protocol, signed by President Reagan, and the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, signed by President George H.W. Bush. It's important to mention that these laws were not easy efforts. The Clean Water Act was a bill fraught at birth from its introduction on the floor to the moment it became law. President Nixon literally waited until 40 minutes before the deadline to veto the proposed Clean Water Act. The Senate handily overrode the veto, and the House followed with a similar bipartisan majority. However, the dispute didn't end until 1975, when the Supreme Court finally ruled the president cannot frustrate the will of Congress by killing a program through impoundment. Nixon had decided simply not to spend the money that Congress had required in the act. He impounded the money he didn't want to spend. The Supreme Court overruled him. The point here is that the nation's leaders, regardless of party, do have a history of finding their way productively, especially when scientific research and findings demand it. Some of you might recall there was a time when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio was so full of chemicals that it literally caught on fire. Visuals like what happened with the Cuyahoga engage the public and their awareness. Visuals help significantly, particularly with matters like climate change. You've seen that here in Hawaii with measurable declines in rainfall, sea level rise, and warming ocean temperatures, to name a few. Real-life experiences are extremely helpful when it comes to reinforcing scientific predictions. They bring truth to fact. For many ranchers in West Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, climate change was a hoax until this past week when they lost billions of dollars in cattle and crops due to out-of-season, unprecedented wildfires. Economic data and real-life experiences share this in common. I know many of us think that Washington is too hopelessly partisan to ever effectively forge a bipartisan effort like the landmark legislation that has provided incredibly effective regulatory, economic, and policy guidance to our nation since the early 70s. But keep in mind that Washington has always been partisan. There used to be fistfights on the floor of the House, During the Nixon years, Washington was deeply divided as it was under Reagan, maybe a bit less so under Bush Sr. Mitch McConnell voted for those Clean Air Act amendments after all. I'm not going to stand up here and be a Pollyanna. The reality is that Washington might actually be worse than ever before. But if the past is any indication, science still matters, arguably more now than ever. Impressing that message broadly is essential. Although historically scientists have often struggled with engaging in policy, today we have hit an inflection point where silence all but guarantees irrelevance. Silence guarantees complicit agreement. There are ways to engage in policy and to do so without being political. And while most of you in the room today likely aren't scientists, science is a mainstay in your ability to do energy work. Here we are in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and the energy challenges and opportunities the state faces are significant. That, coupled with the uncertainty of a changing climate, including what will happen, where, and how soon, is unsettling at best. Everyone wants to know what is going to happen in the near and long term. Hawaii spends more than $7 billion annually on imported oil. With the commitment by Hawaii to reach 100% renewable electricity by 2045, the pathway to progress must be focused, relentless, and strong. Clearly, the state has strong political leadership locally and at the state level. But what about national politics and the general political landscape across the country right now? How does that come into play here? The 115th Congress is held by the Republicans in both the Senate and the House. And at the state level, Republicans currently dominate state government with 33 governors and 32 legislatures. So today, Republicans represent the interests of 61% of the U.S. population. With a firm grip on the presidency, Congress, and soon the Supreme Court, Republicans have won more political power in 2016 than in any election since at least 1928, when Herbert Hoover was elected to the White House. This greater political context is important to keep in mind as Hawaii continues to serve as an energy leader. And it's not to suggest that Republicans in the majority is a bad or a good thing. It's simply a context and a fact to keep in mind. I'd be remiss to not briefly touch on the President's preliminary budget proposal released last week. How does it bode for science and energy? The cuts proposed are deep and broad. The budget blueprint calls for a significant downsizing of agencies that historically have received steady bipartisan support. The Department of Energy would be cut by a proposed 17.9%, and the Environmental Protection Agency by more than 30%. As the budget now goes to Congress, it's extremely important to communicate with your congressional members and specifically the Appropriations Committee. One strong message I suggest should focus on how science affects and informs the energy economy here in Hawaii. If you want your congressperson's attention, and many of you know this, visit them when they're back here in their home office. Let them know what you do and that you're watching what they do. And importantly, offer them your help, not once, not twice, over and over. Offer your energy data and projections to support and inform their choices and deliberations when they go back to Washington, D.C. Worth considering is the returns we get on investment from publicly funded research. Numbers are compelling. Every dollar spent by the National Institutes of Health typically generates $2.21 in additional economic output within 12 months. The internet, think of that. It was invented in part thanks to the Defense Department scientists and engineers in the 1960s. Today, e-commerce sales are estimated to be a more than $390 billion business. So what should be done? I've had discussions with colleagues who have worked under previous administrations and remain in federal agencies now, including the President's Office of Management and Budget. They have suggested that talking about climate shouldn't be avoided. However, the focus of climate work and research should be nested in an energy frame and demonstrated that what's achievable in the next 2 to 3 decades is more relevant right now than the long arc. Investing today will show a return in the next 20 to 30 years in what concrete ways. Focusing on how the energy work here in Hawaii can continue to provide not only DOE through the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, but also other states and industry, energy lessons and best practices in both climate mitigation and adaptation, learned in real time. Continue to show that your work can strengthen national security and identify and address infrastructure risks. Finally, before I close, I wanted to touch on the March for Science, which NCSE is a partner to be held on April 22nd in Washington, D.C., and in many satellite locations across the United States, as well as other countries who will march in solidarity for the importance of science. Here in Hawaii, there will be satellite marches in Honolulu, Hilo, Kaului, and Lihue. I got it wrong, I'm sorry. The march amplifies that the pursuit of unbiased truth and evidence-based research must be preserved through the scientific process. My hope, and that of many involved, is that the purpose and intent of the march will remain as originally envisioned, that it is a march for science, not a march by scientists. I hope that all of you here today will be participating on April 22nd. I hope that you encourage your children, your colleagues, your neighbors to join as well. Whether it's a march or a mentorship, a hardening of the grid, transitioning to distributed generation, it is essential to protect the ongoing and dogged pursuit of the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Science serves and science matters. Hawaii serves as a strong example of how science can bring a sense of stability and strength during times of uncertainty. In closing, I wanted to quote the purpose that the organizers of the Science March Hawaii cite on their Facebook page, most especially in honor of the vision for an energy future the Maui High School students articulated so well in the video we just saw. The March for Science Hawaii celebrates the scientific process from the heavens above to the earth below. We celebrate science as a foundation to explore life, understand the universe, foster global well-being, and advocate for it to be open, inclusive, and accessible. Thank you so much for your time this morning. I welcome any questions that you might have. Anybody have any questions? I'm looking on my screen. Maybe they're not coming through. I can't see it now. Sorry. Thank you. And despite all of the technology, we still have challenges. So let's see. In Hawaii, I'm going to read each question and then answer it. In Hawaii, permitting entities ignore solid scientific studies in favor of protest groups. Protests beat evidence. What can be done? You know, language matters. I mentioned that in the remarks that I made. I really believe, particularly now more than ever, and I got to tell you, I was 2 days ago, I was speaking to about 400 geophysical scientists, and I had a similar question come up. The interesting thing is many of them would be considered the protest group. And they said, you know, we can't get our policymakers to listen to us. We can't get our local government elected officials to sit down, our permitting people, and understand how we have defensible evidence to help inform their policymaking. And I have to tell you that language is a critical part of communicating effectively when you're having an exchange and trying to build a bridge between science and the transfer of technical data and information between two sectors that historically don't work that often together, even though outcomes of both sides of those sectors are very much complementary. I can give some specific examples about that, but my guess is we'll probably get some questions that will lead to those. In fact, you know what? I'm gonna hit pause. I'm actually going to tell you an example of what I mean by language. You heard Frank mention that I've spent a fair amount of time working with local governments during my career, and I grew up in north central Texas. About 12 years ago, when I was working almost exclusively on climate work and really trying to engage mayors across the country and help them understand why climate change would matter to them and their communities in a very tangible way. As I started on the coast and moved inland on the mainland, I had my eye on the prize. For me, that was Texas, the place where I had grown up. And you know, I couldn't help but think when Gil was making his remarks yesterday morning that the city that I grew up in, which is dear to my heart because it is my hometown, however, it was a difficult place and remains that way. It's named one of the third least sustainable cities in the United States because it has no public transit beyond what's required legally for under the ADA. And my target there was the mayor. His name was Mayor Robert Kleck, a wonderful man. He actually just stepped down after more than 4 terms serving as mayor there, an outspoken and widely regarded Republican conservative. And I asked him, again, this was quite some time ago, I asked him repeatedly, I'd send him letters, I'd send him handwritten cards asking for a meeting, because I just thought if I could sit down with him and talk to him in his terms about climate change, it would make a difference. And I couldn't get a meeting. So I finally pulled a card. My dad is a dean in the local university there, and one of his students who served as his research assistant actually worked for the mayor. So I was able to get a meeting that way. And when I walked into the room that morning, I was really nervous, but very hopeful. And Mayor Kleck looked at me and he said, you know, don't get comfortable. Before you sit down, we need to get clear about 2 things. And I said, okay, I understand. And he said, 1, I need to ask you a question. I need you to be honest with me. Do you work with the Sierra Club? And I looked at him, and I'm a terrible liar. And I looked straight in his eyes, and my hair was shaking, and I said, no, I do not. I was lying. He knows this now. And then he said, and are you going to sit here and talk to me about global warming? Because if you are, we don't need to sit down. And I looked at him again, and I said, I am not, sir. Less of a direct lie, but still a little bit of a lie. What I had done is I studied him before I got there. I looked at the platform that he ran on. I tried to understand his background, and I tried to think about the language that would engage him in the issue that I wanted him to consider. His day job, when he wasn't being the mayor, was president of the hospital in town. Now, Arlington, you may have heard of it. It's home to the Dallas Cowboys Stadium. Not a small place, more than 500,000 people in population. So the hospital is big. Asthma rates in Arlington are significant. So I thought, well, if he's a doctor, I'm going to talk to him about health and climate. So I pulled out of my folder a lot of data that I had culled, and I slid it across the table to him, and I started talking to him about air quality and the difference between clean air and what it might mean not only to the people, particularly the 8-year-olds and the 80-year-olds living in Arlington, but also to the local economy. I'm really proud to say that in his departing remarks when Mayor Kleck left office and went into retirement, he said that one of the 3 things he was most proud of is that he had spent the majority of his time as mayor advocating and leading not only on clean air and air quality, but on climate change. After I left the meeting that morning, it was the beginning of what became a really long-standing and heartfelt and genuine, not only friendship, but shared trust between he and I. So to this question, which is a really long answer, I just encourage all of you again to think about language and think about with the protest groups and on the permitting side, are there any points of commonality? Are there shared interests that you can capitalize on and frame them in terms of data sets that both parties think about? The next question, how should we define clean energy in a scientifically valid way? Numbers. Numbers over and over and over again. Numbers and money. What do people care about when they show up at the polls? Money. What do they remember about their elected officials? Interesting things, but they all track back to their personal experience in the current economy. Is Hawaii going to be a target of the Trump administration because we don't want fossil fuels? Consistent with what I've been saying this morning, I'd really turn that around, and I'd say, does Hawaii want to continue to be a champion and a leader on the forefront of the clean energy movement going forward, and do such an unbelievable job at that the administration can't help but take notice? I would encourage all of you to consider as an outcome of this conference how to organize and begin to amplify with consistency both through your congressional members, but also directly to this White House, the economic gains that Hawaii is experiencing as a result of the investments that it's making in going 100% renewable. The benefits of collaborating so closely with the Department of Energy, the return on the investment of federal dollars. I think those data points are extremely compelling, and I would really turn that around to be a strength for Hawaii, not a point of weakness that you all are leading on clean energy. And the last question, what can states do to substitute for the support at the federal level that DOE has been providing? That's a tough one. I think first we have to see how this all plays out. Remember, the budget that was introduced by the president is a skinny budget. And for those of you that haven't heard that term before, it's just the beginning. It's important to take notice of because it really gives strong insight and lets us know what this administration is thinking and how serious they are about it around the level and role that the federal government will play going forward, at least for the next 4, possibly 8 years. At the same time, and that's why I said it's important not only to engage with congressional members, the Appropriations Committee plays a very big role in the final version of the congressional budget. And there are ways to look at the folks that are serving on the Appropriations Committee and to engage with them directly. Letters matter, and constituent engagement matters. And I would just close by saying it matters not to poke at them and agitate folks. They're already under a tremendous amount of pressure. You couldn't pay me enough money to be a member of Congress right now. I have such deep admiration and regard for people who choose to do that day in, day out. But rather than poking at them, thinking about how you can give them data, how you can give them information that reinforces their ability to advocate for the priorities that you have, that we all share the clean energy future. Thank you so much for your time this morning. I appreciate it.